There was a man who knew he was about to die. He stood at the entrance to a valley, looking at the narrow path that wound between two mountains, and he knew that if he walked through it, he would never walk out. His name was Lieutenant Kale, and he was 23 years old. He had joined the Empire's army because his family was poor, because the Empire promised food and coin and a future. He had never wanted to be a soldier. But here he was, standing in formation with 24,999 other men, waiting for the order to march into a valley that felt wrong. The cliffs were too steep. The path was too narrow. The silence was too complete. Every instinct he had screamed at him to turn around, to run, to refuse the order. But he did not, because disobeying meant execution, and he had a younger sister back home who needed the money he sent every month. So he took a breath, gripped his spear, and stepped forward into the valley. And in doing so, he walked into a trap that had been prepared for weeks. A trap that would turn this valley into a grave for 25,000 men. A trap so perfectly executed that it would be studied for centuries. Not as a battle, but as a massacre. Do you know what it feels like when the mountain falls on you? When the earth itself becomes a weapon? When you realize that the enemy is not the soldiers you can see, but the land beneath your feet and the rocks above your head? The Imperial Army walked into that valley confident. They had superior numbers, better equipment, professional training. They were marching to crush a rebellion, to put down a guerrilla force that had been harassing their supply lines. It was supposed to be a simple operation. Find them, kill them, go home. But the guerrillas were not waiting to be found. They were waiting to spring the deadliest trap in military history. And when they did, the valley did not just become a battlefield. It became a tomb. The Empire had been expanding for decades, swallowing kingdoms and territories, imposing its rule on anyone who resisted. Most fell quickly, but in the mountains, a resistance had formed. Not an army, a guerrilla force. 3,000 fighters who knew the terrain, who struck at night and disappeared into caves and forests before reinforcements could arrive. They were farmers and miners, shepherds and hunters. They had no formal training, no uniforms, no supply lines. But they had something the Empire did not. They had desperation. And they had a leader who understood that you do not need to be stronger than your enemy. You just need to choose the battlefield. Her name was Sarah, a former mining engineer who had watched the Empire execute her husband for refusing to pay tribute. She had studied the mountains her entire life, knew every valley, every cliff, every unstable rock formation. And she knew that if she could lure the Imperial Army into the right place, she could bury them alive. The valley was called the Dragon's Throat, a narrow canyon that ran for 2 miles between sheer cliffs that rose 300 feet on either side. The path through it was barely wide enough for 10 men to march abreast. There was only one entrance and one exit. Local people avoided it. They said the rocks were unstable, that landslides happened without warning, that the wind howled through it like the screams of the dead. The Empire's scouts had mapped it, noted the risks, and recommended avoiding it. But the Imperial general was impatient. The guerrillas had been attacking his supply convoys for months. He wanted this over. And the Dragon's Throat was the shortest route to the rebel stronghold. His officers warned him, "The terrain is dangerous. We could be ambushed. We should take the longer route." But the general refused. He had 25,000 soldiers. The rebels had barely 3,000. Even if they attacked, they would be crushed. Besides, his soldiers were professionals. They could handle a few rocks. He gave the order to march through the valley. And Sarah, watching from a cliff above, smiled. The preparations had taken weeks. Sarah and her fighters had worked every night, moving in silence, careful not to leave evidence of what they were doing. They had identified the weakest points in the cliffs, the places where the rock was fractured and unstable. They had drilled holes and packed them with explosives, crude mixtures of sulfur and charcoal that would detonate when ignited. They had pried loose massive boulders and braced them with wooden supports that could be kicked away at a moment's notice. They had built platforms hidden behind rock outcroppings, where crossbowmen could fire down into the valley without being seen. And they had placed spotters at both ends of the canyon, ready to signal when the entire Imperial Army was inside. The trap was set. Now all they had to do was wait. The Imperial Army entered the Dragon's Throat at noon. The front of the column reached the valley floor and began the march through. The path was narrow, forcing the soldiers to compress their formation. 25,000 men stretched out in a line that ran the entire length of the canyon. They marched in silence, unnerved by the towering cliffs and the echoes of their own footsteps. Lieutenant Kale was near the middle of the column. He looked up at the cliffs and saw nothing. No movement, no sign of the enemy. But he felt watched. It felt like 1,000 eyes were staring down at him, waiting. He tightened his grip on his spear and kept walking. Behind him, a younger soldier whispered a prayer. In front of him, a veteran muttered that this was a bad idea, that they should not be here. But they kept moving, because orders were orders. And the Empire did not tolerate cowardice. It took an hour for the entire army to enter the valley. The rear guard had just passed the entrance when the spotters gave the signal. Sarah, standing on a platform hidden behind a boulder, raised her hand. 3,000 fighters, positioned along both sides of the canyon, tensed. They had waited for this moment, trained for it. And now, finally, it was here. Sarah lowered her hand, and hell came to the dragon's throat. The first explosions went off simultaneously at a dozen points along the cliffs. Not loud, not like modern bombs, but enough to crack the rock, to destabilize the already fragile formations. For a moment, nothing happened. The soldiers in the valley looked up, confused by the sound. And then the cliffs began to fall. Massive slabs of rock, some weighing tons, broke free and plunged down into the canyon. They hit the valley floor with impacts that shook the ground, crushing soldiers beneath them, smashing through armor and bone like they were paper. Men screamed. I tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The path was too narrow. The column is too compressed. And the rocks kept coming. Boulders that had been braced with wooden supports were kicked loose by guerrilla fighters. They rolled down the cliffs, gaining speed, smashing into the soldiers below. A single boulder could kill a dozen men, breaking bodies, shattering shields. The Imperial Army, which had been marching in formation, dissolved into chaos. Soldiers tried to press themselves against the cliff walls, hoping for shelter. Others ran toward the exits, only to find them blocked by more falling rock. Sarah had timed it perfectly. The landslides at the front and rear of the valley sealed the exits first, trapping the entire army inside. And then the real killing began. From hidden platforms along the cliffs, crossbowmen opened fire. Not in volleys. There was no need. The Imperial soldiers were packed so tightly that every bolt found a target. Men fell with bolts through their necks, their chests, their faces. They raised their shields, but the bolts were coming from above, from angles shields were not designed to block. Officers shouted orders, trying to organize a defense, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of falling rock and the screams of dying men. Some soldiers tried to climb the cliffs to reach the attackers. They made it 10 feet, maybe 20, before crossbow bolts punched through their backs and sent them tumbling down. Others tried to form shield walls, but the rocks did not care about shields. A boulder the size of a cart smashed through a formation, killing 15 men in an instant. Lieutenant Kale found himself pinned between two groups of panicking soldiers. A rock the size of his torso landed 3 feet from him, splattering him with blood from the man it had just killed. He looked up and saw shapes moving on the cliffs. The guerrillas, barely visible, hidden behind rocks and shadows. He tried to raise his spear, to throw it, but what was the point? They were 300 feet up. He could not reach them. No one could. They were ghosts, untouchable, and they were killing his entire army without ever coming within sword range. He dropped to his knees, covering his head with his arms, and prayed, not to the Empire's gods, but to any god that might be listening. Please, let it be quick. Let it not hurt. Let me see my sister again. But gods do not answer prayers on battlefields. The massacre lasted for 3 hours. 3 hours of rocks falling, bolts flying, men screaming. The Imperial soldiers had no enemy to fight, no target to charge, just cliffs and shadows and death raining down from above. Some men went mad. They attacked each other, convinced that the soldiers next to them were enemies in disguise. Others sat down and waited to die, their minds broken by the helplessness of it all. A few tried to surrender, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. But there was no one to surrender to. The guerrillas did not show themselves, did not call for a ceasefire. They just kept firing, kept dropping rocks, kept killing. Because this was not a battle. This was extermination. When the sun began to set, Sarah gave the order to stop, not because the job was finished, but because her fighters were exhausted. Their arms ached from loading crossbows, from kicking boulders, from pulling triggers on explosives. They had killed for 3 hours straight, and even hardened guerrilla fighters have limits. The valley fell silent. No more rocks, no more bolts, just the sound of wind and the groans of wounded men. Sarah looked down into the dragon's throat and saw carnage beyond anything she had imagined. The valley floor was buried beneath rock and bodies. Thousands of corpses, crushed, broken, piled on top of each other. The path, which had been clear that morning, was now impassable. A mass grave 2 miles long. Of the 25,000 soldiers who had entered the valley, fewer than 500 were still alive, and most of those were too injured to walk. The survivors stumbled out of the valley as night fell. Lieutenant Kale was one of them. He had been at the edge of the column, far enough from the worst of the landslides to survive. But he was not unscathed. A rock had shattered his left arm. Crossbow bolts had killed the men in front of him, behind him, beside him. He had spent 3 hours wading through blood and bodies, slipping on gore, listening to his friends scream and beg and die. And now, as he emerged from the dragon's throat, he collapsed. Not from his injuries, from the weight of what he had just survived. He lay on the ground, staring at the sky, and wept. Not for himself, but for the 24,500 men who had not made it out. News of the massacre reached the Empire 3 days later. The Emperor refused to believe it at first. 25,000 soldiers, wiped out by 3,000 guerrillas? Impossible. But the survivors told the same story. The valley, the trap, the rocks and bolts and helplessness. The Emperor sent investigators. They returned with reports that confirmed the worst. The Imperial army had been annihilated. Not in a battle. In a slaughter. The guerrillas had suffered fewer than 100 casualties. Most of those from accidents, rocks falling in unintended directions, platforms collapsing. The Empire had lost an entire army, and the rebels had barely been scratched. The Emperor, furious and humiliated, ordered another army to be raised. But his generals refused. They had read the reports. They understood what had happened. The guerrillas had not just won a battle. They had rewritten the rules of war. They had proven that geography could be more deadly than any weapon. That a small force, fighting on terrain they understood, could annihilate a larger force no matter how well trained or equipped. To send another army into those mountains would be suicide. The massacre at the dragon's throat became a turning point. The Empire, which had seemed unstoppable, suddenly looked vulnerable. Other territories, inspired by the guerrillas' success, began their own rebellions. They studied the tactics, found their own valleys, their own cliffs, their own ways to turn the land into a weapon. The Empire tried to adapt. They avoided narrow canyons. They sent scouts ahead to check for traps. They marched in smaller, more mobile units. But it was not enough. The damage was done. The myth of invincibility was shattered. And within a decade, the Empire's grip on the mountain territories was broken. They withdrew, declaring the region too costly to hold, and the guerrillas claimed victory. Sarah became a legend, a national hero. Statues were built. Songs were sung. Children were taught her name and told that she had saved them from slavery. But Sarah did not feel like a hero. She had killed 24,500 men in 3 hours. Most of them had not even seen her. They had died confused, terrified, helpless. And yes, they had been invaders. Yes, they had come to conquer and enslave. But they had also been people, sons and brothers and husbands. Men like Lieutenant Kale, who had joined the army not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. She visited the dragon's throat once, years after the battle. The valley had been left untouched. No one wanted to clear the bodies. No one wanted to disturb the dead. The path was still buried beneath rock and bones. Scavengers had picked some of the corpses clean, but most remained, mummified by the dry mountain air. She stood at the entrance and looked at what she had created. A monument to desperation. A testament to what happens when people are pushed too far. and she felt no pride, only exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying the weight of thousands of deaths on your shoulders. She had saved her people, but the cost was a valley full of ghosts, and she knew they would haunt her until the day she died. Lieutenant Kale survived the war. His arm never healed properly. He could not hold a spear anymore, could not fight. The Empire discharged him with a small pension and sent him home. He tried to return to normal life, but normal did not exist for him anymore. He had nightmares every night. The sound of rocks falling, the screams of men, the sight of bodies crushed and broken. He could not walk through narrow streets without panicking, could not be in enclosed spaces. His sister, the one he had been fighting for, tried to help him, but she could not understand. She had not been there. She had not felt the valley turn into a trap. No one who was not there could understand. Eventually, he left home. I started wandering. He did not know where he was going. He just knew he could not stay still. And one day, his wandering took him to the mountains, to the edge of guerrilla territory. And then, without really deciding to, he walked toward the dragon's throat. He stood at the entrance, just as Sarah had, and looked into the valley. The bodies were still there. He could see bones scattered among the rocks, rusted armor, broken weapons. He stepped inside, walked the path he had walked years ago. And this time, he made it all the way through. It took hours. The path was treacherous, blocked by debris. But he climbed and crawled and pulled himself forward. And when he reached the other side, he sat down and cried. Not from pain, but from release. He had survived. He had made it out. And maybe, just maybe, he could finally start to let go. He never went back to the Empire. Never saw his sister again. He stayed in the mountains, living in small villages, doing odd jobs. And sometimes, people would ask him if he had fought in the war. He would say yes. And they would ask if he had been at the dragon's throat. And he would say yes. And they would go quiet. Because everyone knew what had happened there. Everyone knew it was a place where 25,000 men had gone to die. The dragon's throat remains a graveyard to this day. Locals avoid it. Say it is cursed. That the ghosts of the dead still walk there. That you can hear screaming on the wind. Historians visit occasionally, study the terrain, marvel at the ingenuity of the trap. They call it a masterpiece of guerrilla warfare. A perfect ambush. But they do not stay long. Because even now, centuries later, the valley feels wrong. Feels heavy. Feels like a place where too many people died too quickly. The Empire eventually collapsed. Not because of the dragon's throat alone, but because of what it represented. The beginning of the end. The moment when the invincible army was revealed to be just men. Mortal, vulnerable, and utterly unprepared for an enemy that refused to fight fair. The guerrillas won their independence, built a nation, and they built it on the foundation of a valley full of corpses. That is the truth that history books do not like to mention. That freedom is not won cleanly. That sometimes the price of survival is a massacre. And that the people who pay that price, both the killers and the killed, carry the weight of it forever. Sarah died an old woman, surrounded by family. Honored and respected. But her last words, whispered to her daughter, were not about glory or victory. They were an apology. I am sorry for what I did. I am sorry for the men I killed. I am sorry for the valley. Her daughter did not understand. She thought her mother was confused, delirious. But Sarah was not confused. She was finally saying out loud what she had carried in silence for decades. That victory does not erase guilt. That necessity does not erase pain. And that the ghosts of the dragon's throat would follow her even into death. This is the story of the Hidden Valley Trap, of how 3,000 fighters annihilated 25,000 soldiers, of how geography became the deadliest weapon in history. But it is also the story of Lieutenant Kale, who survived and spent the rest of his life trying to forget. Of Sarah, who won and spent the rest of her life trying to forgive herself. Of 24,500 men who walked into a valley and never walked out. And of the truth that war, no matter how justified, no matter how necessary, leaves scars that never fully heal. The dragon's throat still stands. Still silent. Still waiting. A reminder that sometimes the land itself can become an executioner. And that when it does, there are no heroes. Only survivors. And ghosts.